Good. So now we're going to dive into the slides. So we have a few slides that are very high level, so apologies if you already all know that. We'll go pretty quickly through it. Just a recap of how the electricity grid works in Texas since we've liberalized the grid in the 2000s, early 2000s with Pat Wood and George W. Bush. So essentially there's a couple of different segments, right? You need to generate the power, obviously. Then you need to transport it to consumers. So there's transmission and distribution, which is more like highways and then, streets. And then you have the retail, which is people selling power to consumers, whether they're industrial or residential. In Texas, what we've done is we've made both the generation part and the retail part competitive. So you can set up your company, go develop a natural gas power plant, register with ERCOT, interconnect it, sell power to the grid. Same thing on the retail side. You can set up your retail shop, buy electricity from the market, and then sell it to your consumers and bill them every month. What we have not deregulated is the transmission distribution, which continues to be a regulated monopoly by the PUC. The main reason being we don't want people starting to set up poles and wires everywhere to just serve different consumers. It's just very inefficient. It wouldn't be a good use of anyone's money. And so we just have decided that every territory is going to have one transmission distribution utility that's going to serve all the customers in the area. And then we're going to regulate them to make sure they don't overcharge customers. Good.
Okay, so transmission lines are the way that you move power from generation to load at high volume. And distribution lines are, once you get to a local area that needs the power, like a neighborhood or parts of a city, they step down the voltage at a substation, and then the wooden poles you see in your neighborhood are distribution poles. Typically, except for very old ones, the metal poles are the ones that are transmission. There's some exceptions. There's some hardened distribution poles in areas that are hurricane prone, for example. Right? And so if we're going to deliver energy to a growing economy, we have to do it either via transmission or by putting generators everywhere where there's customers, which would be inefficient.
Right. Well, maybe let's start with why we're building new transmission today, the problem, right? Because I think for a long time, people had forgotten about transmission, really. We weren't too worried about it for a while. But really what's happening is we're going from the period more or less since the 1990s where, demand for electricity has been growing very slowly, maybe 0.5% a year or so. It's still been growing in Texas, but not very, very fast. To a point where it's accelerated in the last few years. And that's a combination of the Texas economy doing very well, people moving into the state, but also industries and new consumers coming into the state to add a lot of load.
Fun fact, he said Texas has been growing consistently but slowly. Many other states haven't. Texas was the exception. Right. So Texas has always been growing electric demand, and it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, that's a great point. But we're now looking at something that's sort of different. It's not just accelerating growth. Is now we have the data center business. Obviously, we've all heard enough about AI and the need for data centers that they have. That's looking at adding enormous amounts of demand into the state. And they're looking across the U.S., but the reality is Texas is a good place to do business. It's a good place to interconnect power. Costs are relatively lower. And so Texas is attracting a big portion of this investment. And so we're sort of looking at this wall of demand growth, potentially. The red line is the ERCOT forecast. Forecast is this bit of a contested term because it ends up being more of an aggregation of all of the requests they've received, essentially. So everyone, or almost everyone that's looking, they're doing some risking, but almost everyone that's looking to interconnect, essentially, is included in this curve that they have, which is very, very sharp increase in demand.
an important thing is that load forecasting used to be much more of a science with a mix of art, and now it's a lot of art with a mix of science.
Yeah.
And that's just because of the uncertainty about who's coming to the state and when.
Exactly.
Aren't we already seeing data centers that are on that curve as PUC or ERCOT says, okay, we're ready for you to connect, or we want your money now, that they're actually pulling their applications?
I don't think we've seen anyone pull their applications. We've seen people get connected, right? We have, I think, close to 6 or 7 gigawatts of data centers now on the grid. Now, what we've seen is a big difference between how fast people want to get connected and how fast they can actually get connected, right? So this is what people would like to do, but we at Aurora do a lot of analysis around like how fast can you really do it, and we think the orange curve is actually the more realistic curve. We can all debate, exactly where we land, but essentially the big problem right now people have is how fast can you build that transmission to connect people, and that's the big bottleneck.
Yeah. What you might be thinking about is there's a proposed regulation at the Public Utility Commission to set the fees to interconnect a data center, and this is from implementing SB6 that was passed last session. And the proposed fees that were initially suggested the PUC have been cut once, and there's still a lot of advocacy to say cut them again. And some of the smaller data center developers have said, this could stop us from building, sites that we think would otherwise be viable. I think the public policy goal of having the fees is to try to, validate that these are real customers. And what it forces them to do is connect them with one of the large hyperscaler companies who do have significantly sized balance sheets and can afford to pay fees. But also from a state perspective, you wouldn't want the fees to be so high that you're over collecting fees to protect ourselves against, growth that can't happen because you collect the fees. And so there's a balance. This is actively being considered by the Utility Commission, and it's not a settled question yet.
It's 58481
Yes.
is the big item of contention at the PUC right now. It's a very in the weeds. There's a lot of items in that docket. So
Okay, and we need to stay on schedule, so we're going to spend less time on the future slides than we have in the past slides.
All right, let's go a little faster. So there's a lot on this slide. We're not going to go through all of it. I think there's just a couple of points to understand. So the way the ERCOT grid is structured is essentially at the node level. You can think about it as like an electrical substation. Basically, when ERCOT runs the grid, they solve for where demand is, for where generation is, and how much transmission capacity. And it creates price signals at every single of those nodes or substations, right? To essentially tell people like, hey, this is the cost of getting the power to you at that specific location, or this is how much your generation is worth at that specific point, because if you're generating in a place where there is no demand, well, that generation, if there is not an ability to transport it to demand, that generation is sort of worthless. So we don't want you to actually inject.
And so if the congestion occurs and a generator is not needed because it would just overload that transmission line, they get a lower price.
That's right.
And then if you need a generator in an area because there's not enough power flow to get across the transmission line, you want to pay extra for the generator that's already in the right place. And so that creates a spread between prices that's called congestion.
Yeah. And the idea is it incentivizes people to put generation where it's needed, right? As opposed to generation in the middle of nowhere where there's no demand.
Right.
Good. So the main thing to really remember here is congestion, right? So it costs money to the system to have these price differences. And the way to resolve that congestion is to build more transmission capacity, more transmission lines, or upgrade the transmission lines.
Yeah. So more in congestion. We just talked about nodal pricing, and this is oversimplifying a lot, but if generators are helping or hurting, they get a higher or lower price. And if the price gets too low, below their costs, they'll shut down. And that's ultimately, that happens through like cost optimization, where ERCOT's trying to deliver the power for the least cost. But consumers don't pay that nodal price. Consumers pay an average price for the area. So there's like an average price for Houston, or an average price for South Texas or West Texas. And so consumers, because most of them probably wouldn't respond to these like locational price signals, it's like a consumer protection issue just to average it all out. But the reason that we send the nodal price signals to generators is cost causation. And that's a key concept in electric markets, which is you want to charge people for the cost they're creating in order to create an incentive to lower the costs. And in many cases, that's an application that we use in market design.
Good. Maybe just to give you a sense of what those congestion costs look like in Texas. Well, first of all, in terms of the size, right, it's not small. It represents $1 to $2 billion a year. So it's a lot of money. Now, compared to what system costs are, right? System costs in Texas are anywhere from $15 to $30 billion, depending on weather and conditions. So that is roughly 10% of the system costs. So it's still an issue that's worth looking at. And where do they appear? They tend to appear in places where we've built a lot of generation, but there's not enough demand. So South Texas, where we've built a lot of generation, West Texas, especially transferring it to Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio. And then there's some specific sort of local issues that also can appear on certain lines. But those are, if you have to think about the big problems we have to solve with congestion, they tend to be a lot of the west to north, west to south flows.
Are you going to touch on congestion revenue rights at all, or is that a little too in the weeds?
We don't have a slide about it, but I can briefly mention it. So congestion revenue rights are the way that the wholesale market allows people to hedge this risk by participating in an auction where they say, we think it's going to cost $1, and so we're willing to pay up to 95 cents to get insurance against that. And then all that revenue from that auction goes back to customers.
Right. Because if you think about it, right, like that congestion is a bit artificial. It's ERCOT is pricing things at the node, but that means ERCOT's collecting more money from people in consuming areas than it's paying generators. So there's a pot of money right there.
Right.
And that pot of money is redistributed through that mechanism to help people first hedge, but also because ERCOT's not just going to keep it.
And the goal of congestion is to charge people money, because then they'll be incentivized to do the right thing based on cost causation.
Good. Maybe just very briefly, right? So this is what we call curtailment, and this is for wind at the top and solar at the bottom, which is when generators will decide to stop generating because the price at their specific node is too low. They're creating a lot of the congestion, so the price signal just becomes very low. It can even become negative. And so at that point, they are losing money. They're not going to continue generating. To give you a sense, that can be a lot of generation. For a wind asset, and depending on where you're located, that's up to 10, 15% of your production. For a solar asset, especially during the summer, it can go way up to potentially 30, 25, 30%. And we tend to see a lot of congestion happen in the West, where there is less demand, more generation, or in the South as well, especially in the sort of Rio Grande area, right?
Yeah.
The Rio Grande Valley.
So a key thing here, you notice how this impacts solar and wind generation, but as we said earlier, we're not building transmission for them, because in the wholesale market, they choose to where they want to locate, and if they get curtailed more, that's a business risk that they actively entered into. And also remember that the people that pay for transmission are consumers, and so we'll get into the implications of that, but I wanted to connect some dots I'll pull on later.
That's right. It's totally a private risk that they don't get compensated for. Good.
Okay, so another transmission topic is increasing landowner conflicts. And, many of us are familiar with a not in my backyard term or NIMBY. And, that's, some people are proud to be called that. People think it's pejorative. But local officials, in some cases, listening to their constituents, are expressing concerns about, the impact of transmission going through particularly like scenic areas or historic areas. And so there's not, the only way to stop a transmission line is to convince the PUC to put it somewhere else so that it's not needed. And, what the PUC does is they have the power of eminent domain to condemn this and take the land from the landowner. And so they balance the public good of the overall need for transmission and serving all the demand for electricity in a growing state with the individual interest of the people we're building next to or through. And so they have this certificate of convenience and necessity hearing that lasts 180 days. The acronym is CCN. And people are notified via mail or in the local newspapers that there's a proposed transmission line near them. And then the utility commission often has like multiple choices of which ones to build, and they'll pick one that balances cost and local interests.
Good, and I think that wraps up the problem. So what are we doing about this, right? Like can we solve some of these issues? And so that kind of touches on what drives the need for new transmission, and it's essentially three main things. Knowing the first one is by far the largest one, which is serve new and growing demand. So it's connecting new customers, especially new industrial customers, but also new residential commercial customers. That's done at the distribution level typically. That is what has driven the Permian Basin Reliability Plan that we'll discuss later. The second one is around maintaining reliability and reducing congestion costs. So ERCOT will do a study every year. We'll look at reliability issues on the system where they might have stability issues that they need to look at, or congestion costs in the specific lines or reaching a certain thresholds that we'll talk about in a moment. And that is considered, where it's considered that upgrading the line is in the public interest to reduce those costs.
So earlier you heard us say we don't build transmission for generation, and here we say that we do. We'll touch on it later, but the only reason that we do is if it saves consumers money. So the savings in congestion are more than the cost of the transmission line.
That's right. And then the last bit is we do build a little bit of transmission just to connect the generators to the nearest line.
Right.
But those, it's important to keep in mind, those are called interconnection projects, and they're only a few miles long. So imagine like I'm just building my facility and I'm just tapping into the nearby transmission line.
And there's a cap on the cost of that. The legislature 4 years ago put a maximum amount that ratepayers would be pay into that. Anything above that, the generator bears.
That's right.
So we were hinting at this, but there are three reasons that we build transmission. These are the criteria that the PUC and ERCOT apply when determining whether to build a new line. One is just pure reliability. If you don't build it, you could overload another piece of equipment and cause it to break. We're spending money on this. We don't want them to break. And we also operate the grid so any one transmission element can fail, but the lights stay on. And so we operate it as though we're ready for that one thing to go wrong and keep the lights on. And if you're curious, that's called N-1. And then cost savings, with the one we just mentioned, if the overall cost is less than the savings, it's worth building. And then there's a new one that's a resiliency component where it might not pass one of these tests, but the commission is confident based on their own research that it's necessary, and so they can declare something a resiliency project.
Well, I think we were going to skip that one. So again, lots on this slide, and this is because we have clients that go really deep into this stuff, but most of what you need to understand is we didn't used to spend that much on transmission over the last decade, $1 to $2 billion a year. This has increased massively in the new plans, where we're now looking at $7-8 billion a year. This big number is over multiple years, so this is not 36 billion in 1 year. But it's driven by this new reliability needs and all of these new loads coming in. And this is happening across the state. It's happening a lot in West Texas and the Permian Basin, where we are seeing a lot of this congestion, preventing the demand from oil and gas from being realized. We're seeing a lot of congestion in the south, and then Dallas-Fort Worth is also an especially hot area in terms of transmission upgrades right now.
So, quick question if I may. So you're saying that that's showing 36 billion in total transmission build out expected by what date?
So that includes the 765 kV line. So that is all going to up to 2035 for a lot of this.
I've been struggling with trying to find a good source of firm data showing the expected total transmission build out costs for all of the large loads that are coming. I've heard that the closest version we're going to get is in the ERCOT batch study when they finalize that, but it's been very difficult to get a broad perspective on what the total system upgrade cost would be. So where can we get that?
The reason you can't find it is because it doesn't exist.
Right.
And you know, the batch process is this term that ERCOT is using to study all the new large loads together, for those that are familiar with that term. And the first results, according to what ERCOT's published, and this is still in negotiation, won't happen until
January, right?
Yeah, January, and then I think we'll get our chance to commit loads in March. Which
of next year.
Yeah, which is, I think, during a legislative session.
Funny timing.
Yeah. And then by August, we'll have a transmission plan based on who committed. And that's when we'll first know. But also, there are a bunch of individual planning efforts. Everything so far here hasn't gone through that batch process. And so there's other ways to improve transmission that are also improving transmission.
Now, on top of, and sorry, just 1 second. On top of that, there is a sort of initial transmission plan that's approved already that assumes a certain amount of load is coming in, right? So there's a sort of baseline that we know we're committed to.
Right.
The question is, how much more do we build, right? Based on the new loads coming in.
Does that include the large load expectation? Or that
It includes some of it, not the whole like 300 gigawatts that's in the queue, but includes some of it.
It was the load that requested in time to be in that study.
Yeah.
Who pays for those anticipated transmission projects? Is that the state or how is it?
Yeah, so we'll have some slides on transmission cost allocation shortly.
Well, it's the next slide.
Oh, look, it's the next slide.
So yeah, I can go through it. So these are very complicated formulas. We don't need to go into every single detail, but basically the idea of how transmission companies get paid is they're recovering their capital costs through your electricity bill. So they spend capital on transmission and distribution, right? New lines, upgrades, anything, transformers, anything they need to do on the system. And those projects need to be approved by the PUC depending on the threshold of investment and voltage. And what they do is once they've spent that money, they go get it validated at the PUC, and the PUC allows them to earn a regulated rate of return on that investment. So they get paid the capital plus the regulated rate of return, and then that amount of money is then spread out to all consumers. So it goes to industrial, residential, commercial consumers based on the percentage of the sort of demand they've taken. Now, there's some subtleties around 4CP with industrials. There's way to lower your transmission bill if you stop taking from the grid at certain times. We can go into that, but the base principle is that you then spread out the cost to all consumers. There's a few other charges. So basically, operational charges. There's a number of sort of policy-driven costs that are also existing. Those are just passed through at cost. So they don't earn money on those specific programs.
But they're required to do it.
But they're required to do it.
So high level, consumers pay for transmission, and consumers include everyone from the smallest to the largest companies. And so, importantly, also, it's not a tax. It's a fee that shows up on your electric bill.
Yeah. So that if you look at your electric bill, right, like TDU charges. So if you live in Dallas, it's Encore. If you live in Houston, it's Centerpoint. You know, if you live in South Texas, it's AEP.
Right.
Good.
So transmission cost allocation. We in Texas we do this thing called postage stamp pricing, which if you has anyone mailed a letter, or is that too antiquated? Yeah, but you put a stamp on it, and the stamp costs the same whether you're mailing it to somewhere on South Congress Avenue or to Anchorage, Alaska. It's the same price, and so that's what we call it, postage stamp pricing. Everyone pays the same wholesale rate based on their electric demand. If your electric demand goes up, then you pay more, and if it goes down, you pay less. So the 4CP thing he talked about earlier, some sophisticated large customers reduce their demand during the time we measure it in order to reduce their bill. That doesn't reduce the pot of dollars that Olivier described earlier, and so that moves the dollars onto other people. And when transmission costs were very low, that was there's something that people complained about. But now that we're seeing an increased total quantity of dollars, it's a bigger issue, which is why the legislature included in the second to last section of SB 6 that the commission needs to study 4CP and its alternatives and bring back a report to the legislature next session. Great question. We have a lot of TLAs, 3-letter acronyms, and 4CP, the 4 coincident peaks. So the maximum peak for the entire ERCOT grid in June, July, August, September, they sum all that up and compare it, and that's how they figure out the total demand.
The reason they did that initially, right, is because it was desirable to have large industrials reduce their demand in the middle of the summer when it was very hot to help the grid, right? So we didn't have to overbuild so much for them.
Yeah.
The problem is now it's taken such proportions, they're very good at it, that they're actually avoiding too much of those costs.
Right. And so in response to that, there's a lot of concern last session, and it's ongoing, that, well, how do we, if we're going to spend tens of billions of dollars on this transmission for these new large customers, how can we make sure that they pay their fair share? A lot of the largest companies have made public commitments. There's a recent one where several of them and President Trump or the White House have made a commitment to, pay their costs and pay not impact other consumers. Specifically, how that happens is something that has to be worked out. Some of the hyperscalers and the other industrial loads have proposed a minimum transmission charge, and I just want to, declare a potential conflict. I represent some of the people that are calling for that minimum transmission charge. But essentially what it would do is not let them lower their consumption during those 4 CPs. Or if they do lower it, it won't impact their transmission bill, because they'll still be charged for a percentage of their total requested demand, even if they reduce it to try to avoid the cost. So that's one of the ideas that's floating out there.
Does that lock them in at a rate where they're paying a minimum?
Yeah.
But does it also cap them, or are they still going to pay?
Yeah. So if they use more, they pay. So let's say they use 100% of the contracted demand, they pay for 100% of the demand. If they try to avoid transmission costs, it would put a floor on how much they can avoid, or put a cap on how much they can avoid. So we'd always charge them a certain amount of dollars, regardless of what they did.
Could you get into the percentages of usage versus payments based on customer class? I know it's rather specific, but
So-
I think it's important for the context to understand who's using what and who's paying for what.
Yeah. So you have to very much simplify, right? You have 2 buckets in your power bill. You have the energy bucket, which is how much power I use for my fridge and my oven, throughout the month. And then you have the transmission bucket, which is not how much you used over time. It's just the size of your connection. Like if you have a huge house and big pool and so you need a very large, power connection. You're going to pay more than if you have a, studio with just a fridge. And so you have those two charges, right? The transmission charge pays for the infrastructure. The energy charge actually pays for the generation, pays for people producing electricity, right? For a residential customer right now, you can think about it very simplistic terms as 60% of your bill goes to energy, to the generation, if 40% of your bill goes to transmission distribution. That's been increasing a little bit over time. And so when you're building all these new load, it's not just is my bill going up because we're investing all this money in transmission, but also do we need to build more generation to serve that load? And that also has an impact, depending on what we build, on the energy cost portion of the bill. And that's totally different from the transmission part.
And when you say totally different, you said this earlier, but I want to repeat it. The investors are the ones that decide to build generation and take on that risk. And these transmission lines are approved by the state, right? And so when we say we build generation, it's, do the investors in generation think they can make money by building a new generator?
Private companies.
Yeah, private company. And then we skipped over the third bullet real quick. In many other states, we hear about how hard it is to do business. One example of that is it takes a long time to get a transmission line approved in other places compared to Texas. And that's just another example of how Texas is kind of ahead on permitting issues.
I think there was a question in back.
Yeah, since these transmission lines, they earn their costs back through these kind of rate-based regulated returns. What mechanisms are in place to kind of prevent the overbuilding of this infrastructure?
The Public Utility Commission.
That's the only mechanism we have, is basically if the Public Utility Commission reviews their transmission spending, considers that it's not frivolous, there is a process there, but we don't have a sort of formula. Some jurisdiction, like in the UK, have a formula that forces transmission utility to show some efficiency gains over time, but we don't do that.
We also have another state agency that I would be neglectful not to mention, which is the Office of Public Utility Counsel, or OPUC. And OPUC is a state agency appointed by the governor, and all they do is intervene in the PUC's rate cases on behalf of residential and small commercial customers. And so they have stats I don't remember, but they've saved billions compared to a tiny office. It's one of the great cost-saving agencies. Okay.
I don't know, how much do we have to? All right, last part.
All right, so we've passed some bills and not passed some bills about transmission recently, and we're going to get into that, assuming that we're good.
Are we good on time?
Okay, we're going to go even faster. So we've talked some about this. HB 5066 was the Permian Basin Plan that led to some of the first 765 kV approvals to serve oil and gas load and other loads in the Permian. And it happened because several of the Permian producers organized to get the bill passed because it was taking too long at ERCOT. And then this ballooning cost for a statewide plan, we've talked about this. The dollars go up. Do the number of people paying for them also go up? That's the key question to make sure that, residential electric bills don't go up.
Yeah. Maybe one more point of 5066, that's something that's often forgotten, but essentially it also included a disposition requiring ERCOT to look at new prospective load and to plan for transmission reliability, reliability transmission upgrades to serve that new load. And so a lot of the sort of very high ERCOT projection in terms of loads are also coming from that same.
Yeah, this was a really good point. You might remember last session when there was a shock about the size of the load forecast. That came because 5066 allowed the utilities to tell ERCOT via a certified letter from one of their officers that this is what we think the electric demand is. And that the utilities would say that all of that load was validated. ERCOT didn't believe it, and so there's a discount that happened during the middle of last session. But that discount was then used to plan some of these transmission lines.
I don't know if we need to spend too much time on the Permian Basin. Just to, if you're not already aware, just a couple of high-level numbers, right? The Permian Basin Plan includes 3 main transmission lines going from the Permian to Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, just to simplify. And then there's a backbone part that is then linking up sort of South Texas, Dallas, and Houston to strengthen that part of the system as well. The total cost for the plan is estimated at about $14 billion right now. And then there's additional projects that are not directly linked to the Permian, but are more part of this regular upgrade cycle that ERCOT does with the new loads. That's another $17 billion. And that's over the next, call it 7-8 years. So call it a $30 billion plan in terms of investment over the next 7-8 years.
And then there are also other ways to improve transmission that also add these costs that are also being approved separately. So we talked about the batch that's coming. And there's also RPG, regional planning group plans that are like local plans that are also added to this cost. Okay, so 3069 did not pass. And it would have required the PUC to adopt a multi-decade planning criteria when evaluating the cost savings of new transmission lines. This has been a perennial topic that's come up for multiple sessions around improving the economic planning. This one was a little bit different because it said the purpose of economic planning is to save consumers money or to benefit consumers or something like that. And we talked earlier about we only build the lines for generators if it's a benefit to consumers, but we look at a short payoff window for when that is. That project in DFW I mentioned earlier, they're replacing 50-year-old lines, but we're only looking at a few years of benefits. The reason we don't look too far in the future is because the future is uncertain. But at the same time, you know, those transmission lines were used for 50 years. And so I think one of the reasons the bill failed is because we couldn't quite figure out, well, how do we account for some of those benefits or discount benefits or something? I expect this will come up again this session. Okay, SB 1665 was chose to die based on Senator Schwartner's desires. When 765 first came up as a topic, it was during session. And so he filed a great strategy bill to say, you can't do 765. And so everyone that wanted to do it had to go and justify why they wanted to do it. And once he and the Senate were satisfied, you know, he just didn't advance the bill. But it's a great example of how you can use a bill to create a discussion. Okay, what's next? So we've talked about increased transmission planning. You know, those 3 reasons we talked about earlier, reliability, economic, and resilience, are studied independently in many cases. And, you know, they could be studied together. So what if, you know, when we had to replace that 50-year-old line, we could assume that it's going to at least cost some amount of dollars to replace that we have to do anyway, and just like say, these have to be spent no matter what for reliability. Can we upgrade it with an incremental dollars and save consumers money so you don't have to like justify the whole project because you're already going to spend some dollars no matter what? That's an example here. We talked about, this is kind of the 3069 question, expanding how economic planning works and understanding this is, if you're interested in this, you have to understand why the bills haven't passed for multiple sessions and who the different players are.
Yeah, and I think there's an important point here because, you know, the unintended effect of 5066 is that ERCOT's now having to consider every single person that's saying that they're going to build a data center somewhere, writing an officer letter, submitting it to a transmission utility. That goes from basically, you know, Amazon, Google, Microsoft coming with real dollars to build a data center to Joe, who has a ranch and can see a transmission line and thinks he's just going to tap into it and has a project.
And sometimes maybe Joe will have a project and sometimes he won't.
Exactly. But the problem is right now, ERCOT doesn't have a tool to say Amazon's probably more credible than Joe, and so maybe there's a way I can figure out my transmission planning to take that into account.
Right. And so the giant kludge that we used to resolve that question was by saying in SB6, commission go develop financial standards for all these new large loads. And that's why we got to the big numbers we talked about that might, that $50,000 per megawatt is what's in the current draft.
Good.
And then building all this transmission is going to require some people to do it. And there's, I think, lots of opportunity and probably interest in the industry to make sure they have highly qualified people working. And so all this transmission construction, data center construction requires trained, electrical engineers or line workers and everything else. And so there's going to be an ongoing need for, new skilled workers.
And a lot of technical workers, by the way,
Yeah.
obviously on those transmission projects.
So another topic is advanced transmission technologies. So we talk about transmission lines. These are the things that you can install on the transmission line to make it more efficient. In theory, these are much cheaper and increase the throughput on these lines. And there's been ongoing discussion about, whether or not we should do these, and if so, how do you plan them? The utilities are focused on building all these new lines. This can include like sensors or like advanced conductors that can have more power throughput.
Yeah. And the reason is simple, right? Like they don't earn a rate of return on these technologies right now, on most of them. And so they don't really have an incentive to try to do that. They have much more of an incentive to build or upgrade lines. Obviously, very sensitive, complicated topic.
Yeah.
I do think there's a session on this next week as well.
I was gonna say, yeah, we have a whole class just on this next week, so this is just one
Get ready.
preview.
This is just one slide. All right. I think
That's
we're
it.
at the Q&A section. So how much time do we have for Q&A?
About 10 minutes.
Great. That's
Not bad.
25 questions easily. No, I'm kidding. Who wants to go first?
Is it possible to have a different grade for like energy segment in the data center?
It's more efficient to have everything connected because then you can share the generation across all the different needs.
Yeah. I think the question that then becomes relevant is, do you need a separate rate class for data centers to make sure that the costs they're causing to the system are something they pay?
Right.
And that, I think, is definitely on the table.
What's your rate class?
So basically, the way this works, right, is each utility has rates, right? If you're residential customers, you have a certain rate. If you're an industrial customer of a certain size, you have a certain rate, et cetera, right? Right now, data centers are just bundled with industrial customers, right? And so they take advantage of some of those lower rates and also some of the dispositions like 4CP that can help lower those rates even more. Some people are suggesting, well, why don't we create a class just for you data centers, which creates all sorts of questions, right, as to what is a data center exactly. But if we do that, then we can more accurately reflect those costs into what you pay every month for transmission.
We've got two from the front table. Who wants to go first?
Well, just I was looking on my phone because I was curious, but PUC put out a report on 58484 about their expected costs for the various methodologies of 4CP that they're looking at. In that report, they broke out the percentage of the wholesale transmission service charges that are paid by the various classes. And I'm just going to rattle some numbers here real quick. So residential, they said that the residential class paid 46.7%, but only used 34.49%. Non-residential, so I would take that as essentially a smaller industrial, 25.21 is what they paid. They only used 19.8. And then 14,000 CP clients paid 28%, but used 45%.
That's right.
So I just want to make sure we're on the same page and understand the scope of what we're talking about, the number of entities that are using the bulk of the power and how much less they are paying than the residents.
Yeah.
I think that is very important.
It is.
Clear on.
It is very important, and there's a range of reasons that's the case, and it ranges from more efficiently using electricity to having more lobbyists. But both are applicable. Like when you're bigger, you're more efficient, but also you can argue in your own interests.
And as a residential customer, you cannot avoid transmission charges. You can't do 4CP. You're not eligible, right? Even if you wanted to. And so you're kind of stuck with those rates, right? Whereas as an industrial, if you're large enough, you could start taking advantage of that. And that's exactly, that disparity has grown over time. And that's exactly why in SB 6, the PUC was instructed to revise the mechanism to make it more fair.
Yeah.
And in that same report, it actually shows over time that delta is widening. So that trend line.
And the reason's simple. They're just becoming better and better at doing exactly what 4CP is incentivizing them to do, which is just get off grid right when we're measuring, the peaks, because they have a natural gas generator, they have a solar farm on site, they have a battery.
Industry that helps them.
Yes.
Avoid 4CP.
Correct.
But one of the questions is is it in the public interest to also let residential consumers participate in 4CP? Because it doesn't change the total amount of dollars, right? So it would shift, just like it shifts from industrial to residential. When industrial is 4CP, it would shift within the residential class if some could and some couldn't. And so it would benefit people that could, afford a home natural gas generator or a home battery over people that couldn't.
So there's a number of proposals out there, and that gets very nitty-gritty. I don't know if we want to get into that. There's 8CP, 12CP, minimum amounts.
No, that's for next year's sessions. All right. Any other? You got a question, Brandon?
Kind of stemmed off of what he was saying, but you were saying there's residential and industrial. Is it just those two, or is there some?
No, there's also I think a couple. That's a small and large commercial classes.
Yeah, commercial classes.
So on your landowner slide about landowner concerns, I guess how tailored can the PUC get about the line? Because in our district, we have literally a state park with dinosaur tracks, and the line is proposed to go straight through it. So can they zigzag?
They can zigzag, and they also have alternative transmission lines that don't go through dinosaur tracks. Okay,
because they're irreplaceable.
Yeah. And so, maybe we just create more dinosaurs to solve this problem. But they greatly consider feedback. One of the impactful ways to do that is to have a letter from a member show up in the docket. And there will be a transmission path that solves that problem. The question is, what route does it take? So the Utility Commission is intensely interested in balancing that, and they spend dozens of hours in some of these meetings just listening to landowners and what they think. People come into Austin to give their opinion, and the commission will often ask them follow-up questions. And it's fun to see people like me that are there for some other business purpose having to sit through all the landowner stuff because it's the public utility commission.
Yeah, you said there was ongoing discussions about putting data centers in sort of a separate kind of rate-paying class.
Yes.
Have we seen any analyses on, so far, the subsequent effects? I mean, in many rural counties, those ratepayers are going to be the same body of individuals as the taxpayers.
Right.
Have there been any analyses into seeing kind of what the break is? Obviously, it's dependent upon the county, but what the tax break is for the abatement process versus the subsequent strain they see on the grid and what they're paying in the rate?
That's a really good question. Not that I'm aware of, but I've been trying to get a tax analysis done. This is, I think, going to result in a lot of new tax value. And, I'm not a tax expert. I think everyone else here is, right? But the way that, that then pays school district taxes will influence questions around recapture and school funding, right? And so it's going to be complicated. There are some abatements, but there's recently I've seen abatements get denied too. So there's demand to build data centers in the state, And they will be paying taxes, they will be paying into transmission costs, but there's not any overarching analysis as the sum of all those things yet, and there needs to be.
Do you see there being any feasibility studies being introduced in the form of bills or anything ahead of next session to kind of address that? Or
I bet there will be.
Yeah.
My question is around workforce.
Uh-huh.
And is there any planning around housing, and can you speak to how long those projects are and how long those individuals are in the middle?
Yeah. Great question. I have spent a lot of time when I'm not doing electricity, doing code amendments on land development codes. They're, especially in these small towns that are getting data centers, you know, the population could increase by 20, 30%, or even double, depending on the size of how small the town is, right? And so that could impact the cost of the existing residents who live there. If you're a homeowner, maybe your property value increases. If you're a renter, your rent goes up, right? So I am aware there's a broad swath of things that, you know, data center companies are trying to do in order to reduce community opposition. And I have heard some of them talk about, well, let's work with these small towns to update their comprehensive plan to manage this growth in an affordable way. And others are not doing that, right? So it's a good question that's worth follow up on.
Yeah. I think typically we've been seeing some of the larger tech companies. I've seen Microsoft, Google make statements that the way they want to develop it is more inclusive of the community, of education,
Right.
of supporting the communities. But, you know, obviously there's a lot of data center developers out there, and they're not all doing the same thing.
Yeah, and so I'm sure there will be a lot of data center lobbyists coming through the Capitol, and you know that's a totally fair question to ask, because you know some of them are thinking about it and some of them aren't.
Where does it fit in the equation whether or not the data centers are bringing their own generation or not?
Great. So there's a fun acronym at ERCOT, BYOG. When you bring your own generator, there are some trade-offs.
Right.
And ERCOT needs to keep the grid reliable, so they study everything, 10 ways to Sunday. And one of the things they study is the loss of the generator. And so if you're hoping that the generator will be able to justify your data center, depending on how they do the studies, they look at the load or the consumption without the generator. That's decreased the incentive for people to bring their own generation. And so ERCOT and the PUC are working to try to address that. But the problem with serving these giant data centers is not fundamentally a markets problem. It's an infrastructure problem. They need to be able to consume 1 or 2 or 3 gigawatts at a single location. And that means a transmission line or a generator or both.
And oftentimes we're seeing now both, right?
Yeah.
As like a bridge solution. Because there's a lot of talk about, what if data centers are just going to go on their own and they are going to build their own natural gas generator and figure it out. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Right.
For some very simple reasons. Like the grid provides a lot of stability benefits. The grid is the only thing that has a 99.9999% reliability. Your generator is going to need to go on maintenance. Sometimes it trips, sometimes it's too cold. And so you need to be able to have that reliability, and that reliability is essentially the grid more than your own generator. So even people that are looking at building their generator are looking at some point at a grid connection.
I think we haven't been cut off, so we can keep asking questions.
I'll cut you off.
All right.